Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I'm joined again by Sarkis Gekcian, and we are going to be we're going to be doing our part two. We promised that we would have a part two of our Wrath of God discussion. So you'll recall that last time we addressed this question of the wrath of God by pointing out that as we look closer at this doctrine, we find that there's actually a lot of overlap between how Christians and how Hindus view the wrath of God. And so instead, we urged, whether you're a Christian or a Hindu, we urged everyone listening to our discussion to think of this as a topic, one of hopefully many topics, on which Christians and Hindus are actually in agreement and move from there. This can actually be a point of contact between our two faiths that that we both believe in an objective sense of justice and morality, and that God answers our injustice and immorality with his perfect righteousness, and does so in a just way that requires justice to be done, and that this is understood by people who perceive it as wrath. So now we mentioned that we were going to do a part two in that video. So Sarkis, what was left unsaid? What is there for a part two?
Okay. So first of all, is my video on?
No, no, your video is not on. I thought that you did that intentionally.
No, 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 no. Let me
Okay.
1 second. Let me figure that
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, no worries.
In the final edit, we could just make sure that.
Yeah, no
Oh,
worries. No worries. So, a couple of things that uh looks like it started to bring up video and then kind of went out. Let's see.
huh, strange.
But not to worry. Most people are going to be listening, not, you
Yeah.
know,
Yes.
so it's not a big deal.
It is what it
Um,
is.
so one thing that I know we wanted to talk about was kind of mischaracterizations of the wrath of God that might be levied against. So sometimes when people are objecting to the idea of the wrath of God, they're actually objecting to a concept that Christians don't really believe, or at least that historically Christians have not really believed. Um, and so, if your objection is, well, I don't believe in a God who just hates people and just wants to punish people and is, throwing a temper tantrum, well, guess what? Neither do we. And in fact, as Sarkis pointed out last time, neither do Hindus, actually. Neither Hindus nor Christians believe that God is just sort of capriciously venting rage at human beings. So we can get that out of the way right away, that that's simply not something either side of this particular debate believe in.
Yeah.
Um, so with that said, Sarkis, what are some other things that we wanted to make sure we talked about this time around?
Well, just to sort of build on what you were just saying, one biblical passage that really stands out to me when I was looking at verses sort of having to do with the patience and long suffering of God is one that really sort of uh, emotionally moved me, and it was I believe it was from Micah. Um, it was basically, I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember word for word, but God is basically saying, "My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you?" Like, like he's practically pleading for them to like turn away from their evil ways and come back.
Yeah,
So he like far from. I mean, yeah, there are passages where he says, like you're messing up, boy. Get on
right.
get on the straight and narrow, or else. because obviously that's necessary. So there are also passages where he's practically like it almost feels motherly, like practically pleading with the Israelites, even to the point of saying like, "What have I done to you that you're breaking my heart like this?" Like,
Right.
um, so so like that particularly jumped out at me. Another one was Jesus famous,
Weeping over Jerusalem.
yeah, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill and stone the prophets, how often I have desired to gather you under my wing and you were not willing.
Hmm.
So yeah, people don't often think of those passages. So so now I would want to, oh yeah, so the thing that we forgot to talk about, and so we have this part two, is how this pertains to your former tradition, Calvinism.
Right.
And
Yeah,
just
so
okay,
for those who don't know, yeah, so for those who don't know, before I was Eastern Orthodox, um, I spent a long time in the Calvinist tradition. Um, I there was in one of my debates, somebody in incorrectly said that I was a Calvinist pastor. That's not true. I was a pastor in the seventh. I was an assistant pastor in the Seventh Day Adventist tradition. I was never a pastor in the Calvinist tradition, but I was a member of a Calvinist church for a very long time. Very firm defender of Calvinism. Did Calvinist apologetics. You can still find all my debates on YouTube, and there's good value in a lot of them. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not like Calvinists get everything wrong. Um, in a lot of my debates where I was debating against SDAs, yes, I was coming from a Calvinist perspective, but I was arguing for Christianity, and I got a lot of things right. So, um, but yes,
yeah.
that's
So
absolutely correct.
one thing that I will because before we um in the spirit of charity, before I criticize a certain group or school of thought, I'll point out its merits, like what I think is praiseworthy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I do give Calvinists credit for is that Calvin had a very robust covenant theology, and so he
Yes.
didn't. So unlike Luther and other Protestants, he didn't make this sort of obnoxious break between the old and new covenant.
Right.
Like, oh, that was all in the past, and that's all over and done with, and now it's
Right.
like he like obviously he believed that there are certain things that have changed in the paradigm of the new covenant, but he saw the new covenant in many ways a continuation of the old and not just like this whole new thing with the break in continuity. So he he seems to have, from what I read of him, had a very big emphasis on the continuity of covenant, like
Right.
God's covenant people.
Yeah, Calvin is actually, one of my. I'll probably be a little bit controversial to our base here, but one of my favorite books still to this day is John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, um, which is actually four separate books, but that's a topic for another day. But the Institutes is just a really brilliant, brilliant work of theological reflection. Um, and in it, he argues for lots of things that are things that I hold dear. He argues for the doctrine of the episcopacy. He actually argues kind of against his own base in that he argues for the historic episcopacy and even argues that apostolic succession is essential. Um, so he
Really?
actually would not have agreed with the idea of like Presbyterianism that you can just start churches. No, he believed that you needed apostolic succession. He believed that the only way to preserve apostolic succession was through the episcopal form of church polity that Eastern Orthodoxy uses. He rejected the papacy, obviously,
Yeah.
but so do we. And so he wasn't rejecting the episcopate. He was rejecting the specific form that it takes in Rome, which I would argue is a good thing. So, yeah, Calvin actually makes lots of really brilliant points, and I highly recommend, people read the Institutes of the Christian Religion, especially if you are a Calvinist, like actually read the Institutes. I think you'll be surprised how quote unquote Catholic it actually is. I think you'll be very surprised to see how much John Calvin himself is really not anything similar to the sort of modern Calvinist evangelical kind of thing that has spun off over time. And if you're calling yourself a Calvinist and you haven't read the Institutes, then maybe ask yourself why you call yourself a Calvinist, but you haven't really read the most essential work of John Calvin. Like that's kind of weird. But that's the most common thing I find is that people call themselves Calvinists and they've never read John Calvin in their life. So they don't really know what Calvin taught, but they use his name. So anyway, point
This
being
this,
that like
yeah,
really good
this
books.
this is all new to me, honestly. I just want to take a quick second to just say wow, because I thought the whole Presbyterian system of ecclesiology originated with Calvin. I thought he said like, oh, I thought he basically held that the bishopric is something that emerged as a later accretion, and that you should just have a body of elders or presbyters and stuff.
Yeah,
I
so that is a very common view, but yeah, if you read the Institutes of the Christian Religion, I believe it's in book 4 that he gets into it. It's been a long time since I've read it, but he does talk about the episcopate and the episcopal polity, and he argues that that's the only way to preserve apostolic succession and that it's necessary. Um, Now, he also gets into some things that he's against that are coming from the Catholic bent, but I would actually agree with him on most of those points,
right.
if not all of them. And still, so the person who really comes up with Presbyterian polity is actually John Knox in Scotland. He's the guy
Okay.
who used to like to burn down Catholic churches and send people to defecate in the Eucharist and stuff like
Oh
that.
my
So really not a good
God.
guy. Yeah, really not a good guy. He's the one who came up with Presbyterian church polity, and then it sort of took off in the Reformed movement from there. And then the United States, the
Of
most
course.
common form of, yeah, the United States is where um, two separate kind of schools of thought were prominent in the early settling of the United States. One was Presbyterianism, and specifically British Presbyterianism, and the other was Reformed Baptists. So 1689 style London Baptists were the other major stream in the United States. A lot of people don't know because Baptists today usually aren't Calvinist. Today, Baptists are usually what's called Arminian.
Not to
Which
be confused with yours truly.
Right, not to be confused with Armenians. It's an I, not an E. Uh, so an Arminianism is actually a Dutch tradition that splintered off of Calvinism, and basically, and then that got really popular in the U.S. because of in the 1800s there was a preacher named Charles Finney who was very successful in the United States at um, winning people to not so much winning people to a specific denomination that was Arminian, but what he was really about kind of ecstatic experience. And so he's the one who invented the idea of like altar calls and very emotional music, that you're
Yeah,
using very emotional music to sort of manipulate an emotional response from people and then get
right.
them. And so his sort of method of doing this became very popular, and his theology happened to be very Arminian. So that's why in the modern day, if you go to evangelical churches, they usually have a bent that's more Arminian. But early in American history, the vast majority of Baptists were actually Calvinists. And so,
Uh,
uh, so yeah,
would this include like the Puritans in places like Salem?
yeah, yes, actually, the Puritans were Presbyterian. So, in fact, funny enough, back when my wife and I were Calvinists, we visited we were in a trip in Virginia and we visited two Presbyterian churches while we were there. One was a very recently established Presbyterian church, but very traditional in the Presbyterian sense. So, exclusive psalm singing, very true to the Puritan kind of
Yeah.
way of actually doing things, very Puritan in their theology. And then the other church we visited was one of the actual churches established by Puritans who had come to this country from England. So this was a church that was very old in American history, but when we got there, they had pride flags. So the churches that were
Uh,
actually established by Puritans have ironically become super liberal today. Um, but the Puritan tradition is still alive in the United States, unfortunately. It still exists very much in a lot of these Calvinist Presbyterian churches, but yeah, the Salem witch trials, all those guys were Calvinists.
uh-huh. Not surprised. Anyway.
No, no, and you have to understand that the reason why things like that take place comes down to the Calvinist sort of confusion around a couple of things. So Calvinism has a really weird relationship with the idea of church and state. So Calvinists are actually the ones who come up with the idea of separation of church and state. Before Calvinists, nobody believed that. Not even Martin Luther. Nobody believed in
No, yeah.
separation of church and state. Um, Everybody thought that was a stupid concept. Calvinists are the first ones to come up with that, but weirdly, they also hold to a doctrine or the best Calvinists also hold to a doctrine called Reconstructionism, where your goal is to try to basically rebuild Israel, ancient Israel, in the modern world. Except without monarchy, because another tenet of Calvinism is they hate monarchs. So they don't want monarchy, but they do want everything else that existed in ancient Israel. So you end up with this very bizarre relationship between the church and the state. And so that's what's actually going on in the Salem witch trials, is that those early settlers are basically experimenting with their confusion around which aspect of Calvinism is going to prevail in this country. Is Calvinism going to because back then pretty much everybody settling is a Calvinist, so they agree about Calvinism, but they disagree about how to apply the tenets of Calvinism. So is it going to be separation of church and state, where you can't really enforce religious principles on people, um, which doesn't work, but that's a topic for another day. Or is it going to be um, this this other relationship, this kind of what would later come to be called Reconstructionist understanding of church and state? Which of these is going to exist in the new world? Um,
And I take it that the Puritans sort of belong to the Reconstructionist camp.
Well, that's the thing is that the Puritans really belonged to both.
Oh,
Um, so what ends up happening is and this is why the early United States gets really confusing because what happens is so over in England, they had Anglicanism. So they established church as the Church of England. Um, and Puritans really didn't like the Church of England because even though the Church of England was theoretically Calvinist, it was also monarchist. So they really didn't like it. Um, which, as an aside, that was actually what attracted me to the Church of England for the brief time that I was a part of it was because it seemed like the only way that I could be a monarchist and a Protestant. Um, so I, so anyway,
yeah,
Anglicanism is very monarchist, but it also has this kind of Calvinist bent. Well, the Puritans were Calvinists who rejected monarchy, and so that becomes this huge conflict in England that eventually gets the Puritans to leave England and come here, where they're trying to experiment with. So, on the one hand, they reject monarchy and they reject all of the monarchist principles of government because of this doctrine of separationism. On the other hand, because of what would later come to be called Reconstructionism, they really think that Christian nations, quote unquote, should be governed by a sort of trying to rebuild Israel
mhm,
in our time. So they try to build all of this, and very quickly it's revealed that none of this works because, on the one hand, you can't pick and choose what you like out of ancient Israel and then toss out the rest.
right.
On the other hand, you can't really have a moral government that isn't in some way making reference to religion. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah,
It,
and I think I can sort of draw from my former Hindu background on this that
right,
um, okay, uh, ancient India would probably be somewhat the closest to what we would call a secular state in pre-modern times, but only insofar as belonging to a certain religious tradition was not obligatory to being in the monarchy. So, for example, you would have a monarch in the Maurya dynasty, the most famous dynasty of India.
hmm
Uh, that and the Mughals. But yeah, you'd have the Maurya dynasty where you'd have one king um, that would belong to, say, the Ajivika religious tradition. And then you'd have the next king who would be a Buddhist and another king who would be like a Vaishnava or something.
right,
And all of these kings, regardless of what they belong to, they would sort of give like patronize all the religious traditions. So a Hindu king would lavish gifts and funding on Buddhist monasteries as well as the Hindu ones, and the Buddhist one would do the same and stuff. So there's sort of like a I don't know what I would call it, like because it wouldn't be like purely secularism where where the government is a religious.
right.
It's more like pluralism.
Yeah, it's
Um,
what Russia is trying to do right now. So Russia is really, there's a lot of controversy because on the one hand, Russia is more or less trying to become an Orthodox country again, and Putin is pretty clear about his desire that Russia be an Orthodox country again. But on the other hand, a lot of people are critical of the fact that like Putin funded the building of a mosque in Russia. Putin has funded the building of a bunch of Hindu temples in Russia. So it's like, and a lot of people have asked, like, okay, so how can an Orthodox country do this? Well, the answer is that basically Putin is trying to do exactly what you're talking about. It's like Russia will be sort of Orthodox in the sense that that's what the state religion is, that's what Russian people are, but everybody else also gets to live in Russia and have
their own places of worship.
semi the right, have their own religion, um, and that I don't know how well it's going to work because I think it works well for like Christians and Hindus because they can get along well in Russia and not
Yeah.
bother each other.
Yeah,
It
and it worked. It continued to work in India after the coming of Christianity to India.
right,
You still have stories of like Hindu rajas financing the building of churches and stuff.
right.
And so like
Where it
it
breaks down is Islam because
right,
Islam
right.
tends to be pretty hostile to anybody who isn't Islam. So,
Yeah,
like,
because and I'm not saying every individual Muslim thinks like this, but this sort of phronima of Islam is be peaceful while you're the minority,
right,
but always keep in mind the eventual goal of outnumbering the kafir and sort of gradually in stages bringing the country to Sharia. Like
right,
and you see this in places like England where they've done surveys of Muslims in England, like in places like London, and they've said that if they could, they would. Well, in the more modest end, they say they would like England to have Sharia law. In the
right,
more in the more aggressive, in a slightly more moderately aggressive spectrum or part of the spectrum, they say if they could, they would implement it. And finally, on the most radical end of the spectrum is eventually we will. That will be what we do. Eventually, once we outbreed all these British people
right,
and stuff. So yeah, so yeah, I absolutely agree. Like for Christians and Hindus and Buddhists, like in Central Asian parts of Russia, there's a Buddhist area. Um,
right,
Pretty much everybody other than the Muslims, it'll work fine.
right. It's gonna it comes to a head with the Islam thing
Yeah,
to a certain degree.
at the same time, I can understand why Putin's doing it because
Yeah,
as disturbing as it is, Muslims do make up uh, at least a significant part of the Russian Federation.
they
So
do. They do.
you unfortunately have to do a bit of appeasement there.
Yeah, I mean they do. It's true and yeah. So and you know, I'm not trying to criticize Putin. I don't want his job. So, you
Yeah,
know, it I don't necessarily agree with every decision the guy makes, but I don't want to have to
yeah.
be the one making the decisions. So I'm not gonna
I don't agree with most decisions the guy makes, but I like ideally I like the sort of model that in principle they're trying to do in Russia insofar as like you have a relatively conservative traditional society that sort of has a default like state religion,
right.
but then also allows for other religions to exist without like persecuting them.
Right. It's a very orthodox concept. That's more or less how it was in the Byzantine Empire. You know, there was a functioning Arian cathedral in Constantinople 300 years after Nicaea, before finally all those people just converted or got old and died. And so it's the same, but there was no like active persecution of these people at any point. They were
Yeah,
allowed to do their thing because the Byzantine Empire, though it was Orthodox, it wasn't, it didn't see religions other than Orthodoxy as like a threat to its existence.
yeah.
That's, yeah. Anyway,
So okay. Now I feel like sorry, I know we went on a bit of a
no,
tangent,
we
but I
want
feel
to,
like
but it's important stuff,
it
and it
is
lays
important.
a
Yeah, it is.
foundation too, because you know here's why I went on that tangent about early America is because a lot of and England, okay, and England is because a lot of a Hindu individual, a lot of what they have experienced of Christianity, say some guy from India is arguing with me about why he's not a Christian. or why he doesn't want to be a Christian. He's probably defaulting to some experience he's had with quote unquote Christians, but the people he has encountered very likely are either American or, if he's older, English Christians who believed things very different from what I believe. So, giving that little bit of history about the relationship between the US and Calvinism and Britain and that whole hodgepodge, I think is helpful to someone trying to understand, like, the person you've engaged with, that's what they're coming from, is
Yeah.
that history has formed their religion. All that history that I mentioned has formed the religion of the person you've encountered before.
Yeah.
So just like the history of India helped to form a lot of what modern Hinduism believes and practices and things, the history of the US and England, for better or worse, has very much forged the religion of most of the people who claim to be Christians that have done any kind of um, apologetics in India. And so we do have to be aware of that as we address these things.
Right. And and I completely sympathize. Like if I was if I was a Hindu and that's what I knew of Christianity, the British Empire, the Goa Inquisition from
Right.
of the Portuguese and all the, I would hate Christianity too.
Yeah, I mean, I
Like,
wouldn't, it would not, it's sort of like, so I'm Irish, and when I became, for a very brief stint where I was Anglican, I think that was actually way more offensive to my family than, certainly than me being Orthodox, but than me being even like a Presbyterian, because Anglican, Anglia, England bad. No, you can't do that. Um, like
yeah.
there is sort of this like this default reaction to things that we've experienced that are bad. And so being sympathetic to that and understanding that is good. But anyway, you were starting to kind of get to the meat of our episode.
Right. Yes. So now that we've sort of laid the historical groundwork for Calvinism, like what like Calvin himself believed in terms of ecclesiology and how that changed after Calvin. Now we can get into the fun part, what Calvin actually believed
Right,
in regards to things like double predestination and the wrath of God. And here
right.
I'll sort of let you give give them a like a concise but like detailed
Sure.
rundown, and then I'll explain how this sort of meets with Hinduism in certain regards.
Absolutely. So Calvinism, you'll often hear Calvinists cite Romans 9 as their chief proof text. Just the whole chapter of Romans 9. I don't actually think Romans 9 is all that compelling, and the reason is because Romans 9 isn't fundamentally about individual election. So debates about Romans 9 just sort of disintegrate into whether or not we can apply it to individual election. Um, but there is a much stronger proof text for Calvinism. So I'm going to steel man them a little bit. And I'm
Yes.
actually going to avoid Romans 9. And I'm going to go to the text that I think is a much stronger case for Calvinism. So um, St. Paul says in Ephesians 1, starting in verse 3, he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, so that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestined us to adoption as sons by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise and glory of his grace." So the Calvinist argument is Um, just going off of this text, if you're not allowed to appeal to tradition, you're not allowed to appeal to anything else St. Paul says, you're not allowed to appeal to anything else. You have to only go by the words on the page. That's their thing. You have to only go by the words on the page. It says, "He chose us before the foundation of the world, and he did it according to his good will." So, not because of foreseen faith, not because of something I was going to do, not because of my righteousness, just because he wanted to, he chose me, and he chose me, and he's predestined us. So, the reason why I say this text is way stronger than Romans 9 is because this text is about our relationship with God, you and me, and it's saying that our relationship with God is based on Him choosing us, and that this happened before the foundation of the world, and that that predestination is according to the adoption of Christ to the good pleasure of His will for the praise and glory of His grace. That so the central belief of Calvinism is basically that what texts like this are saying is that before God created the universe, he chose. I'll be really super charitable, and I won't get into double predestination right away. I will get to double predestination, but I'll start with just
Mhm.
single predestination if you don't mind. So,
Yeah.
before the creation of the world, he lays out a plan of what he's going to do. And he says, okay, I'm going to allow humanity to fall into sin. And when humanity falls into sin, I'm going to give some people salvation, and then I'm going to let other people not be saved. So some people are not going to get saved because that way I will display my wrath and power, and other people I am going to choose by grace, based on nothing about them, to save them. So there's no difference in the Calvinist paradigm. There's no difference between me and Sarkis and the guy who God allows to stay a Hindu, um, or Buddhist or atheist or whatever. God is allowing those people to be damned because they aren't his elect, and he has selected us, or more specifically, he's selected the Presbyterians and maybe the Reformed Baptists. Um, Not so much Sarkis and I, because actually most Calvinists see us as damned too. Um, but at least the Presbyterians, maybe even the Reformed Baptists.
Although,
Probably not.
although to be fair, some Calvinists that I've seen do extend that to Christians in general.
Right,
So,
yeah, especially Anglican Calvinists. Definitely. So like Reformed Episcopal and stuff, they tend to see us as saved. Lutherans actually also believe in predestination, and they see us as saved. So being charitable, you can believe in predestination
yeah,
and still believe that all Christians are saved, but you don't believe that non-Christians are saved, certainly, and you believe that this salvation has zero reference to the human person. Um, the sort of This is why non-Calvinists tend to see this as, and I know Calvinists hate this analogy, but I'm sorry, this is what it sounds like to anybody who doesn't believe what you believe. It sounds to us like God is basically going, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you're in. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you're in. Okay, you over here, you're in. Yeah, you. Okay, everybody else is damned. Like, it
yeah.
doesn't make
You actually. I was gonna say something like it. I was gonna call it the cosmic game of Duck Duck Goose.
right. It is. It's the cosmic game of Duck Duck Goose. Like, but. Okay, you're in. Like it just. So that's what the flaw is, but that's how they're. their perception is. And then where double predestination comes in is this creates a huge problem because now John Calvin himself actually taught that human beings had free will. So he kind of avoids this a little bit, but Calvinists today have embraced the doctrine of the Dutch Reformed and of John Knox, which say that human beings don't have free will. So, how does the fall happen if we don't have free will? Well, the answer that comes up is double predestination. And double predestination says not only did God choose who he was going to save, but he also intentionally chooses who he's going to damn. And all of the great Calvinists that you know, their names more likely than not believed this. So, John MacArthur, he believes in double predestination. What's his name? James White, not John, sorry. James White, he believes in double predestination. I don't know for sure about John Piper because he kind of likes to float in between on some things, so I won't throw him under the bus because I'm not 100% sure. But Jonathan Edwards, the great American Puritan theologian, he believed in double predestination. He believed God wanted the fall to happen, and he believes that God wants your um, atheist grandma to be an atheist so that he can cast her into hell and torture her for all eternity because it brings him glory. Um, and if you're not saved, then God wants you to not be saved. And if you are saved, then it's only because God wants you to be saved. That's double predestination, in a nutshell, is and I hate to say it, but this is actually what I used to believe. So I'm trying very hard to steelman this, and I'm trying very hard to word this in a way that I would have recognized back when I was a Calvinist. And I grant that yes, it is a very I understand why people find this to be such an ugly doctrine, and I will briefly try to say that the reason why I believed it and the reason why I didn't see it as ugly at the time is because I was very convinced by the doctrine of total depravity that I deserved hell. And so to me, it was just, I know that I deserve hell. And so if God chooses to save me, then that's awesome and wonderful. And God is so great and merciful because, from my perspective at the time, He should just damn everyone. Everybody deserves to go to hell. So God should just give us all hell.
Just,
Um,
just while we're talking about this, by the
yeah.
way, real quick on Google, look up Calvinist Santa. You like put that image on
Oh
and put that
yes,
image.
I've seen the Calvinist Santa thing where it's
We should put that on screen so that people can sort of listen to us talk about it while seeing like Calvinist Santa like looking at like glaring into their soul.
yes. Oh, the Calvinist Santa. Oh, let me see if I can find a really good one here. The Calvinist Santa. Oh, this one's not. Yeah, so the Calvinist Santa is basically it's like Santa puts everyone on the naughty list because he's a Calvinist now, and so everyone goes on the naughty list and uh everybody gets what is it? I There's like a YouTube video too where he gives each of them like a copy of I can't remember what book, but
Oh,
uh
okay.
he anyway, I can't find a really good meme
Okay,
of it, but yeah,
the one that I was thinking of was like a picture of John Calvin himself as
as
Santa,
Santa,
and then it and then
everyone's on the naughty list. Here,
yeah.
this one's good. This one's good. You'll like this one. Here you go. Everyone is on the naughty list.
Yep, this is
Calvinist
it. This
Santa.
is
And he's got the hat, but it's
it's, it,
oh,
it looks yeah, yeah, I love it. He yeah, he just has like this. This look that's like staring into your soul.
Oh,
But yeah, so I'm actually kind of curious about like where Calvin himself sort of differed from later Calvinists because you said he um you said he believed in free will, but didn't he also believe in double predestination? Because he seems
he
I
did believe in, so,
okay.
well, it's kind of debated actually whether Calvin himself taught double predestination, to be totally honest. I think that he did believe in double predestination because some of his statements talk about him creating people to be evil. Like he makes them evil so that they will do evil and he can damn them. Um,
Okay.
but a lot of people point out that there are other statements in Calvin where he talks about God allowing evil instead of God making evil happen, God is allowing it to bring about good, which is actually the same thing that we believe. You know, Genesis 50 um, says that God allowed the
Yeah.
the 12 brothers to sell their brother into slavery, but it was so that he could bring about good through it. So there is that truth, there's that
Right.
tension, but I do actually believe that John Calvin taught double predestination, and the main reason why I believe that is because there are just too many statements from Calvin where he goes way further than, say, Luther or Augustine, who both believed in predestination but didn't believe in double predestination, and he goes all the way to saying that God actively and basically the reason for that is because the fundamental belief of Calvinism is that God is quote unquote sovereign. And what they mean by that is, as R.C. Sproul, the great Calvinist theologian of our time, he passed away recently, unfortunately, but he was the greatest Calvinist theologian of our time was a man named R.C. Sproul, and he said that he used to use the analogy of there's no maverick atom. And what he meant by that is that nothing happens in the universe, nothing happens, um, no molecule in the universe does anything apart from the direct will and decree of God. So that's the central, most fundamental belief of Calvinism is that there is no, and this is why most of them deny free will, is because if we have free will, then there is some sense in which God is allowing us to do things, whether or not He wants us to do them. And the Calvinist can't really have that in his theology. The Calvinist theology ultimately has to have God in exhaustive control of every detail of creation. Otherwise, they believe that he isn't sovereign. And that is the foundational teaching that makes all of the other Calvinist things fall into place.
Right.
John Calvin himself believed that foundational teaching, but he didn't take it as far as most modern Calvinists do. So, like, John Calvin believed that Jesus died for everyone who would ever live. Most Calvinists believe that Jesus only died for the
For the
elect
elect.
who he was going to
Yeah.
save. John Calvin didn't believe that, and there have always been throughout history lots of Calvinists who didn't quite go that far with it,
Yeah.
but
Um,
yeah. So, and John Calvin, to be very, very gracious, John Calvin never presents the famous acronym TULIP, where it's like total depravity, unconditional. John Calvin never presents anything like that succinctly. For John Calvin, theology is something very complex, and he was very much not about these sort of succinct, like, uh, acronyms where you throw things together. That is something that developed in Calvinism over time. A lot of people attribute it to the canons of Dort. And Tulip is more like a summary of the canons of Dort that comes even later. So the first theologian to actually use the Tulip acronym was in the 1900s. Um, that's not something that was part of
Right.
Calvinism for most of its history, but yeah. So you didn't have to believe in limited atonement to be a Calvinist for most of Calvinist history. That's kind of a newer thing. Um, but but today most Calvinists believe that, and weirdly, like there have been other theologians,
And
like John Gill, who believed that. But
and it seems like in a certain way there's like sort of a gradual elaboration and elaboration because I feel like Calvin felt that he was sort of uh taking certain things that Saint Augustine
right,
held to their logical conclusion, but then he seems to have shied away from from like taking his own theology, and then so it took other Calvinists to then
right.
take Calvin's theology to its conclusion.
And
Until
Calvinists
you
will be super uncomfortable to hear me say this, but it is true. Calvin, even though Calvin did not like Thomas Aquinas, he was actually taking Thomas Aquinas's views of Augustine and developing those out. Now, I don't think he does that expressly. I don't think he does that just like Martin Luther, who also didn't like Thomas Aquinas. But they're taking Thomas Aquinas's interpretations of Augustine and then going further than that, because because Augustine is actually fairly orthodox. Like people don't understand that Augustine actually doesn't go anywhere near as off the rails as people attribute to him.
I,
And
I
then,
I have to. I'm kind of curious. I gotta do more research into his writings because for any of our Hindu friends watching Saint Augustine's writings are as vast as Shankara's writings. Like it's we're talking about like over 10 or like 20,000 pages of
yeah,
so. But from what I have heard, and I've funny enough, I've actually heard this from like a Catholic YouTube channel. In his early career, he was actually very much in line with what the church has always
right.
taught when it comes to justification, election, and all these things. But the I'm not sure how true this is, but the channel is saying that towards the end of his life, he reached borderline Calvinist territory.
Uh, they're
Like,
very close. They're very close. So what happens is in the beginning of his writing career, Augustine is in line with the rest of the church. Then he developed this idea that's called faith and reason, where he's doing apologetics, mostly apologetics, but he's submitting everything to pagan philosophy and to sort of this idea of reason that he has. And so he gets really into particularly Plato. And he goes through this time period, and it just so happens that during that time period was the Pelagian controversy. And so not Calvin. So Augustine works really hard at ab annihilating the Pelagian issue, which Pelagianism is a real it's a real thing. There's no such thing as semi-Pelagianism, but there is a such thing as Pelagianism, and it is condemned by the church. So Augustine gets this right, but he goes way further than he needs to, and so you see him enter into really borderline heretical territory because he's just making these really extreme statements as a way to try to shut down Pelagianism. And then towards the end of his life, he writes a book that is not very popular among Calvinists or Lutherans called The Retractions. And in The Retractions, Augustine basically says, hey, I said a whole bunch of stuff when I was refuting this guy, and looking back now as an older man, I'm realizing that I should not have said this and that I said a lot of really problematic things because I felt like I had to, but I want to set the record straight. And he goes back and he basically goes back and refutes all of this stuff that he had said when he was a younger man. Um, and it's a very good book. And he starts out solid, gets really weird, and then ends his life in a place where he's much more solid again. And he's
Okay.
kind of defending his earlier statements against his later ones.
Yeah.
But the reason why he is so popular among Calvinists is because of that time in the middle where he's trying really hard to labor the point of God's grace against the point of our works, which is a dangerous road to go. Um, Now, obviously, St.
Yeah.
Paul,
I
talks about grace versus works to some
yeah.
extent, so it's not like we can't talk about that at all, but it's dangerous to take that so far that you're like, um,
You essentially reduce the human being to a puppet that needs to then
exactly,
sort of be uh sort of be like uh on God's strings in order to do good deeds. I would say
exactly.
I would say during that middle period, Augustine is definitely at least a monarchist.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
so
he says as much. He says as much. And for those who don't know, monergism is the idea that monergism is basically the idea that I mean, the Greek word basically ends in the phrase one actor. So, um, God alone is acting on us. That's what monergism means. And full monergism is double predestination. God is the only one acting, therefore, he's the one who saves you or damns you, whatever. And then there's soft monergism, which is predestination that God he chooses who he's gonna save and he lets everybody else just do whatever they're gonna do, and they end up in hell. Um, so
yeah.
that's the difference between soft and hard monergism, and to their credit, lots of Calvinists, even though they're monergists, they choose that soft monergism route because they recognize the moral implications
And
if God is just play acting and none of this is real. And I mean
funny you should
yeah,
say play acting. You, keep that phrase you just said, play acting. I'm gonna let you continue, but keep that in mind because I'm gonna use that.
right. Right. Well, no, I mean that's basically so that's where Calvinism breaks down is Calvinism breaks down because again, there is something inherently problematic about it if we say it sounds nice to say, well, it's all of grace, so I contributed nothing to my salvation, it's only God. But that becomes problematic when you get to the point where you're saying, okay, but Christianity isn't universalist. So at some point, we have to deal with the fact that there are going to be people who are not saved. And how do we account for that in our theology? And if you're a Calvinist, the answers to that get pretty dark and pretty disturbing. And you do end up with this. I mean, I really hate to say this because I love my Calvinist friends, but you end up with this sort of Cthulhu god who's very like
Yeah,
very
yeah.
evil,
I
and
mean, I mean, dare I say that? Look, since I'm not a Calvinist or a former Calvinist, I'll I'll be
you'll say
harsh
the
so you don't
quiet
have
part
to.
loud.
Yeah, I'll say the quiet part loud. The Calvinist view of God is more malevolent than the capricious gods of the pagans.
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, well,
And because
because the
Zeus,
thing is that the
uh,
pagan gods are limited in their power. The Calvinists believe in a conception of God who is like our God, all powerful, but is not all loving and is not all good. And we know he's not all good because both good and evil are coming from him. And that's where this all breaks down, is that their conception of God, and they will try to deny this until they're blue in the face, but the problem is that if you believe in double predestination, then you believe that evil is just as much part of God's design and plan for the universe as good,
uh-huh,
which means that evil is originating in God. Um,
right.
and that's where this all breaks down, is that it turns it turns the whole drama of salvation into this sort of play acting where God is the one kicking you off the cliff and the one catching you and being like, "Look, I saved you." Um,
Yeah,
that's
for context, the kicking you off the cliff is the fall.
right, exactly. So he's the one causing you to fall, and he's the one catching you and saying, "Look how nice I am. I saved you." Like, okay, but you also shoved me off the cliff. Like that's
Yeah, and it's like the and this is where I feel like the because getting back to what I was saying about the pagans, like when I say pagans in this case, I'd say the most extreme versions of this would be the Greeks, or let's say the Norse. The Greek or Norse gods, for those who believe in them, the worse they um unless you did something particularly nasty
right,
to land you in some place like Tartarus, right? For the vast majority of people, like if Ares did something capricious that then resulted in your death, the worst that would happen is your soul would then go into Hades and be with the rest of the shades.
right,
I mean, it's not fun, but it's not like torment either. You're just like, okay, I ended up on Ares's like crossfire that day,
right,
or Zeus felt like having a bit of fun, and I ended up on the business end of that.
right,
um, like, but like that with Calvinism, it's like you are a vessel of wrath for his glory. So it's not, he doesn't just kill you; he torments you for all of eternity,
right.
so that he can then look at the righteous people and be like, "See how nice I am? This could have been you."
Exactly. Exactly. Like it's very and so yeah, it's but so I want to know,
Mhm.
Sarkis, how does this tie into I mean, it ties into our discussion of Hinduism to some extent because we're differentiating ourselves from this false
Ah,
theology
right.
that we don't believe, so that if our Hindu friends have been exposed to Calvinism, they know that that's not what we're defending. But um I know that you had another direction that you wanted to take this as well, so I want to explore that.
Yeah, yeah. I was I the reason I wanted to go in the Calvinist direction is because now I'm going to introduce into the discussion the Hindu concept of lila. So,
Not the one-eyed chick from Futurama.
why did I not see that come? Okay, well, okay. For to be fair, I don't see most things coming. So,
Dang.
anyway, but so Leela, because you pretty much you unknowingly laid the groundwork for our next segment when you said play acting. So Leela is essentially a concept in Hinduism, which the word itself, I'll break down the etymology and then I'll sort of explain it in its theological context. Leela is sort of like most Sanskrit words, it's hard to find a good English equivalent, but it means something like play, and it could mean play in two ways. It could be playing like you're playing a game, and it could also be a play like you're putting on a theatrical performance.
Hmm.
And so the view in many theistic schools of Hinduism, but this is especially true in the Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita schools. In Advaita, because again everything is ultimately sort of illusory and impersonal, it's only relatively true insofar as the relative truth of a personal God it goes. But even they believe in this, which is the view that God sort of creates or generates the universe as a sort of cosmic play. And he in the Bhagavad Gita, I can't remember exactly where, but he's referred to as the ultimate controller of all things. So in a certain sense, not entirely. So this doesn't go into Calvinist territory per se, but there's a certain degree of ultimate determinism in Hindu theistic cosmology because um because while God allows for free choices, that like we are free agents, we make choices, he also sort of ordains certain things, right? So for the word that is given to describe God in Vedantic texts, but especially the Gita, is karma phala data, which is the bestower of the fruits of karma. So, because of that, let's say, so one makes choices, and this sort of is like a eternally reoccurring thing until one is liberated, experiences moksha, and is no longer subject to death and rebirth. But until then, basically, it goes something like this: you, based on choices you've made, God gives you the birth that, according to divine justice, is most perfect, is most suitable as as a response to decisions you've made in previous lives. Um, so such that justice is done, but it doesn't always happen in exactly the next life. It might, so a decision you make now might take a few lifetimes for it to sort of come back around to you. But in some cases, it could happen, next week. In other cases, it could happen in the next life. It depends. But in the grand cosmic scheme of things, all things sort of work themselves out, right? So, and this is all part of God's play because, as to sort of borrow Calvin's usage of Paul,
And then
it's
some
all
people like Hitler are working stuff off for like a whole bunch of lives, right?
right. Yeah, and perhaps one could see it in that way, but to, in an ultimate sense, because this is Leela, this is all like God's sort of grand cosmic play. In any good play, you need heroes and villains. You need good characters and you need bad characters. Uh, you need a in order to have a von Stauffenberg, you need a Hitler for him to try to
Hmm.
kill. Um, so because of that, there is a bit of overlap in Hinduism and Calvinism insofar as God is seen as the the source of both good and evil. So there's one parallel. The other is that he does all things for his good pleasure. They Hindus wouldn't use the language of glorification, like God does it all for his glory.
Right.
With Hinduism, it's more like for yeah, they would say God's good pleasure, like it's in a certain sense, it's like fun. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um, but here's where here's where I'm gonna go with this, which is that Calvinism is sort of a dark version of Hinduism in a certain metaphysical sense, and I'll explain why. Um, because while both believe that God is absolutely sovereign and like at the very least creates the conditions for certain things, right? Um, in Hinduism, it's all okay in the end because, well, okay, I'll give one. There's one exception to this, and I'll save that a little towards the end. But for at least the vast majority of theistic Hinduism, it's universalist. So even if someone spends like 100, what would feel like 100,000 years in Naraka or hell, it will end eventually. And they sort of begin the like hell or Nautica is seen as the bottom part of the wheel of the hamster wheel of rebirth, you could say.
Hmm.
Eventually, you're good. That time will pass, and you're just gonna go. You're gonna move on to the next part of the hamster wheel, and you're just gonna keep going around and around on that hamster wheel until you achieve moksha. But eventually, all beings. It's almost like a law of nature that eventually all beings achieve moksha at one point or another.
Right.
So so all the pains, all the hurts, all the trials, all the tribulations, as much as it sucks, and as much and to I'll be charitable to Hindus. I could see some of my fellow Christians being like, "Oh, that's horrible. All of this because of God's cosmic play, like for His good pleasure or whatever." Yeah, but when we watch them, you have to look at it from God's perspective in Hinduism. Like when we watch a movie, even like a terrible like World War I movie where people are getting slaughtered in the trenches, from our
Right.
perspective, it's like a movie. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And then when it's over, it's like, wow, that was intense, man.
Right.
Um, like so it's easy to be like, what the hell when you're in the movie.
Right.
um, so so I'll be charitable to our Hindu friends here. But anyway, but in the end, it's all okay because the destiny for everyone is eventually to be liberated and be in union with God. So the um the reason why Calvinism is a sort of effed up version of this is because you still have the idea that God is completely sovereign. You have theistic determinism where God, well, depending on how hard or soft you are on this, uh, to whatever degree or another, sort of controls or ordains all things
Right.
because of his sovereignty. And he does it for his good pleasure, right? He it's arbitrary in a sense,
Right.
and and
Well,
and those
it has to be arbitrary because, and I used to hate that. When I was a Calvinist, I used to hate when people would say that it's arbitrary. So for my Calvinist friends, the reason we're saying it's arbitrary is because by your own statement, there is no difference between the person who gets chosen and the person who doesn't. By definition, that's arbitrary.
yeah, and they say like, oh, it's because of God's sovereign will. Well, look up the etymological definition of the word arbitrary. It just means of
Right.
the like by the will or of the will.
Right.
So this isn't. Don't take this as an insult. That's literally what arbitrary means.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So it's like effed up because while there's this sort of overlap with Vedanta and other schools of theistic Hinduism where God sort of ordains all these things as a sort of like the author of a story for his good pleasure. Um, it it takes a dark turn in Calvinism because in Calvinism, for most people, it's not okay in the end.
Right.
There is no happy ending like you have in the Hindu view of like determinism. It like it's that some people, for God's good pleasure, are created to essentially be His divine punching bags.
Right.
In in Whereas at least in Hinduism, in one lifetime somebody could be the villain, but then in another lifetime they're the hero and someone else is the villain. Maybe
Right.
even the guy that was the maybe even the guy that was the hero in the last go around, like
Right.
is now the villain. Like so, everybody sort of gets a turn. um,
Right.
so it's so it's this is where I'm sort of going with this is that I feel that orthodoxy is sort of the middle ground between the two extremes because I would argue that in a certain sense, um, as much as Hinduism, rightfully so, um, stresses being righteous, pursuing justice, being a dharman, like being like a righteous
Right,
person, being a being beholden to dharma, which is God's grand law, like design. In a certain way, it can't by ontological necessity. It's sort of not serious.
right,
It's like relatively serious. Like okay, insofar as you are in this life now, you have certain duties, certain things that are expected of you, and you should be, you know, be beholden to them. Um, because those that righteousness, those good things have their origins in God. Where I would critique Hindus is, well, okay, yeah, but what if I don't want to?
right,
And the answer would be, well, then you receive the appropriate fruits of that karma up to and including, you know, a stint in Naraka, which is hell. But it's like, okay, but eventually I'll get out.
right. There's
Um,
another problem that I see with it that's related to what you're saying, which is one problem that I've always had with Hinduism is kind of the practical effect. Um, and I see this with Calvinism too, by the way. So one of the problems I have with Calvinism in practice is that there's this sort of um like the Salem witch trials, there's this sort of like aggression that gets sort of justified as like, well, we're the elect, we're the ones God loves. These other people, God doesn't really love them, so we can mistreat them because they're not really, they might be kind of made in the image of God, but like they're depraved and we're depraved too, but um you know everybody's a sinner, so so what? God is going to forgive us and these people are evil truly, so we can do evil to them. So those are sort of and I know that Calvinists are going to come in the comments of this podcast and say that's not Calvinism, that's not Calvinism. In practice it is because your Puritans, who you talk about loving so much, are the ones who massacred Native American tribes, the ones who killed people for celebrating Christmas, the ones who massacred Catholic monks and nuns in Ireland, and your Puritans are the ones who said things like, no sin, no crime is a sin if it's committed against the Irish. Um, Oliver Cromwell said that to his soldiers before sending them into Ireland. He said, "No sin, no crime is a sin if it's committed against the Irish because they're Catholic."
and I don't think it's a coincidence. Um, the the historical results are a coincidence when you take into account that the Boers in South Africa were Calvinists.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, you know, we're the chosen city on a hill, and we're surrounded by cannibalistic infidel Negroes. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
like
So you
these.
get these things. So okay, so I'm saying that about my former tradition
Mm.
that we are I am for having been in that tradition, I was guilty in some sense of this thing. Now, I wasn't guilty because I didn't apply it in that way, but I'm saying that I was spreading ideas that I now see bear this bad fruit. But at the same time, I see this flaw in Hinduism because you do see in the practice of Hinduism, um, some really bad fruit. Like, for example, and I know there are lots of compassionate Hindus, but I have known people and I've seen people who and I've known, you know, like I knew a missionary and he spent a lot of time in India and one of the first things he saw when he got there was a very wealthy Indian man walking by a very poor Indian man, and when he walked by, he kicked the guy, the poor man, the rich man kicked the poor man, and when this missionary asked him, "What the heck are you doing?" the guy said, "Well, that guy is here because in a past life he was evil, so I'm helping him to, I'm meting out the punishment of God against this guy." Now, I realize that lots of Hindus are going to be horrified by that story. I'm not saying that all of you guys think like that guy, but my point is that in the practice of these philosophies, we see that just like Calvinism, Hinduism has this problem that it doesn't necessarily encourage you to lead an ethical life, partially because of what you said, that it's like, whatever, it doesn't really make a difference. I'm gonna eventually be just fine. But also partially because there is this sense in which if I see somebody suffering, I can just tell myself, well, he deserves it. There's no such thing as undeserved suffering. Um,
Yeah. Now I
and that's a
will.
really dangerous philosophy because the truth is there are people in this world who suffer horrible things, and we have the ability to alleviate that suffering in various ways. And when we choose not to, we're not acting righteously.
Right. And and here I will steel man a bit because okay, I will agree that oftentimes, unfortunately, that is what happens in practice. Um, at least on paper. And like I said, I know this because I've having read the Hindu philosophers and theologians myself. The way they would say it, the way they would respond to those not very compassionate Hindus is, yeah, the person might be experiencing the fruits of some karma in a past life, but that doesn't mean you have to like put more straw on the back of the donkey and break his back.
Right.
Like like it
And
could be.
besides, you're now messing up your.
Yeah, yeah, like by being essentially by being an asshole, you might be in his place next time around. So be careful. Um,
Right.
God might humble you too. Um, so so they would say like, okay, let's say you have a person that's like mistreated, right, because of their karma. It might be part of the fruits of their karma that they end up like being mistreated or whatever. But then somebody compassionate stops to help them and like gives them food or like helps them get back on their feet, and that's also the fruit of their karma. So you can choose to be like their comfort, you know what I mean? so
Right.
so you know so I will say that for Hindus.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And to I'll extend the same thing to Calvinists. There are tons of very compassionate Calvinists who do really kind works. And there are tons of good Hindus doing good works. So my point is not to say that in every
Right.
instance these philosophies produce the worst kind of
Right.
person, but I'm saying that these
Right.
things lend themselves to this kind of problem where you're really kind of lending it.
Yeah.
I mean, even like
For
yeah,
okay, hold on to that thought, don't forget. But as I say, so my main criticism from of the Hindu sort of like philosophical, cosmological, metaphysical worldview is not that necessarily would breed a lack of compassion, although sadly it does do that sometimes, even quite often. And you guys, you need to look at that. But it's not that because as I explained, like it doesn't have to. You could like some you can be the good fruits of someone's karma by helping them, and you should help them. That's part of your dharma, and that is what is expected of you, by according to dharma. So the my criticism is not that. My criticism is that while you should do that, there's no urgency, there's no sense of
right.
urgency, there's no there's no permanent consequences, because eventually like everything sort of resets itself. So while you shouldn't be an asshole, you could be an asshole, and and the most you would get is like a very very long time in hell, which will
Right.
eventually end. Whereas, whereas Calvinism, I feel like on the other extreme is all breeds a sort of nihilism towards people and like towards compassionate acts because as you pointed out, Kevin, um, if they're not part of the elect, who cares? They're just chaff to be burned
Right.
in the barbecue at the end of time. So it's like both things. Now, both of them in a certain sense, in their own messed up ways, remove the urgency. And this is where I'm going to bring orthodoxy as the middle ground because orthodoxy has the best of both worlds.
Right.
Orthodoxy doesn't have double predestination. We believe that the choices you make are completely your own, that God does empower your will when you give yourself to God, God sort of empowers your will by freeing it up more to as you grow in Him. That's theosis or sanctification, as Maximus the Confessor says in his, like when he talks about the movements of the will. Um,
Right.
I'll get we'll get into that in a second because it's important to our discussion. But there is an urgency because the choices you make are really your own, and if you don't act, if you're not compassionate to your fellow man, if you don't pursue the path of justice, if you don't pursue the path of righteousness, there are permanent consequences.
Right.
Um, but on the other hand, so that's sort of the answer to the Hindu side of things. Like you have to take it seriously because you have like a limited window of time to to get this right.
Right.
But on the other hand, to the Calvinist side of things, there is no sort of pre elect sort of from all of eternity that are just sort of arbitrarily elected. So you better be careful because you might think you're part of the elect. So what an
Right.
Orthodox person would have said to those people abusing Native Americans or the Irish would be like, "Oh, you might think you're part of the elect, but you might find yourself on among the goats on Judgment
That's
Day,
right.
and the person you're abusing, even that African or Native American pagan, might be condemning you and be on the among the sheep on
Right.
Judgment Day. So be
Well, and the
careful.
funny thing too is that the Orthodox faith had been in Africa and to a lesser extent the Americas. So, it's not like they were exclusively persecuting pagan people anyway. Like, there were Christians who received the ire of these, Puritans as well. So it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, you are spot on that it's like just because you think you're better than someone doesn't mean you are, or just because you think that you're justified because of some weird reading of scripture. God tells us to make our call and election sure. And the way that we make our call and election sure is by doing good works for people, not by doing evil. So,
yeah. So I feel like it fixes the problems of orthodoxy. Sort of fixes the shortcomings of both systems. It it for the Calvinist end, it tells people don't be so sure you're in.
right,
Don't get too comfortable because you might just in the grand scheme of things, you might just find out that you're the rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus.
right.
But then to the
Romans
Hindus,
9 is followed by Romans 10 and 11, where God is casting off people who were considered elect and bringing in other people. So,
yep.
don't
So
get too comfortable is exactly how I would respond to that.
yep. And then to the Hindus, orthodoxy says don't be so lax because you have a limited window of time to be good, to be righteous, to pursue the path
Right,
of righteousness. And while God is all merciful and we're ultimately God knows our true hearts and he'll ultimately judge us perfectly based on what is in our hearts. And so, we don't preclude the salvation of anyone with any certainty, including pagans. Don't bank on that
Right.
because um because you're complacent. You might be judged for that very complacency.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
that's why I wanted to bring up Calvinism in this part two about God's wrath, because I wanted to set up this to say that orthodoxy is sort of the middle ground between the worst of Christianity and the worst of Hinduism.
Right. Yeah, it
Um,
it it brings, you know, it does. It brings, and I think it also calls us to, it's good that you point this out because it calls us to something that I believe is very fundamental about Orthodox apologetics, which is, to me, Orthodox apologetics is not you're wrong, you're awful, you need to be more like me. To me, Orthodox apologetics is there's lots that you're getting right, and now here's how to live in the fullness of that reality. We can only live in the fullness of that reality through Christ. So both the Calvinist and the Hindu have lots of things that they are actually getting right, and that they're actually, I'm sure that, like, there's lots of really good Hindus who are really living out beautiful principles. I'm sure there are lots of great Calvinists really living out beautiful principles. But if you want to have the full experience, the fullness of even those beautiful things that you've already found, you can have that only in Christ and in His church, the Holy Orthodox Church. It's not, the fullness of that reality is not found where you are. And that's what I'm proclaiming to you is the joy of that full reality of what you already kind of have in part. So
yeah, and
so you're exactly right that, like, you're shedding, what you're shedding is not, it's not like, oh, I have to, give up this cool thing about Hinduism that I love. No, what you're gonna find is that coming into Orthodox Christianity, the cool thing about Hinduism that you love is present in spades over here. But what you do have to give up is you have to shave off the aspects that are not good, the aspects that are fleshly in the wrong sense of the term, are bad, are evil. We have to shave those things away.
yeah, and one of those things is this notion that God is a source of good and evil. And I used, as a Hindu, I used to hold to this, and as I don't know how often Calvinists would openly accept this, but Calvinism by implication teaches the same thing.
Right,
There's no really getting around this.
right,
Whereas Orthodoxy says no, God is all good and is the source of only good.
right,
So ontologically, where does that leave things like suffering, evil, destruction, or whatever? It's a privation.
right,
Um, and this is some one of the things that we actually agreed with some of the Greek philosophers on, which is that they held that evil is not a force or a thing in and of itself. It's almost like a parasitic corruption of the good.
exactly.
So, and this is sort of derived from um, the ancient Greek and Middle Eastern understanding of things. Now, here's where the Greeks and the Hebrews would probably have worded it differently. So the Greeks would see it as sort of non-existent. So evil,
Right,
varying degrees of non-existence. It's like a hole. It's like a blank. It's a nothing. You know what I mean?
right,
Whereas the Hebrews would have described them more in terms of chaos or the breakdown of order. But
right.
when you put them together, it really amounts to the same thing. Chaos in the true sense of the word is nothingness.
Hmm.
It's when something that previously existed and functioned breaks down and falls apart, and disorder creeps in, and disorder can only exist in relation to order, whereas order contrary to what I used to believe, because I used to believe it was a completely symmetrical yin and yang type thing
Right.
where you can't understand order without disorder and you can't understand disorder without order. No, order is a positive thing. Order can exist in and of itself.
Right.
Disorder can't exist without order.
Exactly. Exactly. You would have no way of it's like the analogy of there's no such thing as darkness. The darkness doesn't exist. What exists is light, but if you remove light, then what you have is the absence of light, which we call darkness, because there is no light. And so, in the same way, evil is not something that exists. Evil is when you remove the good from something.
Yeah, so in a certain way, although we have to be careful with this because again we're not universalists, but it could
Right.
even be said that by sheer virtue of the fact that they even exist, even the demons have some scattered traces of goodness or integrity left in them, because if they
Yeah.
didn't they wouldn't exist.
Right,
um
exactly. Well, it's sort of like demons are the ultimate perversion of something that was once good, although we may not be able to recognize that good. I think God still can, but I don't know that that means that we can.
right, yeah,
But
no, that
there have been some saints who prayed for Satan to be saved.
yeah.
And I have always thought, um, you know, I, to be a little bit controversial, I will say
Mhm.
that I have often thought that there is a certain beauty to, now I don't believe that Satan will ever be saved, but there is a
Yeah.
certain beauty for praying for Satan to be saved because could you imagine like this guy works so hard to get us damned. Like if we had him on our side, that'd be awesome.
Right. Well, and it's the ultimate expression of Christ's commandment to, pray for those who persecute you.
Right.
Who persecutes us worse than the evil one. So
Exactly.
so it's like it's yeah, it's the ultimate, and in a certain way it shames him even more before God, because it's
That's right.
like these these creatures, these humans that you thought of as like fleshly animals that you see as beneath you, are more noble than you, because some of them at least have the common decency to at least hope for the best for you.
Right.
So it's like it sort of humiliates and shames him even more. Like,
Exactly. Exactly. All right, my friend. We're kind of at the end of our time here, but I would like to just do you have any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave our Hindu and Calvinist friends with?
um, yeah, I would say that I'll just reiterate that to, my messages to both sides, that to 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 my Hindu friends, I would say it's this that God loves all his creatures, and to believe and what we do agree on as between Orthodox Christians and Hindus is that whatever God does, and to sort of bring it back around to the topic of divine wrath, whatever God does to like the harshest of punishments are ultimately either for our own good or for the good of those we've wronged.
Right.
And so one of the fundamental tenets that we can agree on is that a God who does not ultimately wish for the good of all his creatures is not a God worth worshiping.
Right.
Because because as a Hindu you believe that in the end all beings, when their time comes, will be freed from samsara and be in union with God. And as a Christian, I believe that at the very least, God desires all of us to be freed from our bondage to sin and be in union with Him for all of eternity. Whether that will happen or not is ultimately in His hands. Whether that happens for everyone, uh, all we can do is hope. But at the least, we agree that God wants the good for all of us.
Right,
And to our Calvinists, I would say, um, maybe rethink whether the God you worship is truly good, and
right,
rethink the assumption, like the thinking of God declared it, therefore it is good because God declared it.
right.
The, that consider that there's more to divine good than just He said it, and that's it. Because the
Yeah, it
because
shouldn't, if something is good, it shouldn't require me to do some kind of mental gymnastics to come up with a way in which it can be good.
yeah. So and and be open to the idea that God really does love everyone, because as I said in agreement with our potential Hindu listeners, a God that does not at the very least desire the good for all his creatures is not a God that's good.
Right.
So that's what I, as the Podfathers would say, that's what I have to say about that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Sarkis, for joining us. I am loving doing these videos so much, these podcasts so much. I just they fill me with joy and delight, and I hope that we can come up with many, many more topics. This was the one I was most excited about as a former Calvinist, so I'm glad we finally did it. Um, but I'm also glad we did all the other ones first because I think this one was more of a passion project. I don't know how many people will actually um be as excited about this as I was, but very much a passion project. So thank you so much for doing this, and I can't wait to for our next opportunity to work together.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you guys very much for watching as well. Be sure to share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.